Hey, welcome. Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible transformations in music history, how the orchestra got a massive upgrade in the 19th century. This is the origin story of that epic sound you hear in pretty much every blockbuster movie today. All right, let's get into it. Just take a look at this difference. Around the year 1800, a typical orchestra had about 40 musicians. 100 years later, it was often over 100. That's more than double the size. Imagine your school suddenly doubling in just a few generations. It was a huge change that completely redefined the sound of music forever. So what gives? Why the massive upgrade? Why did they suddenly need so many people to make music? That's the core question we're going to answer today. And the reason is actually pretty cool. See, it wasn't just about pretty melodies anymore. The composers of this era wanted to create entire worlds with their music. They wanted to tell epic stories, to give the audience goosebumps. And for that, the old, smaller orchestra just wasn't powerful or colorful enough. They needed more firepower, more sounds. So, how exactly did they upgrade the orchestra? Let's break it down section by section. Think of them as hardware updates for each group of instruments. Let's start with the woodwinds, flutes, clarinets, that whole crew. They got a major tech upgrade that allowed the musicians to play way more complex and faster music than ever before. And what's really interesting here is that brand new instruments joins the family. The tiny, high-pitched piccolo and the melancholic English horn brought totally new colors to the sound palette. The bass clarinet added this incredible, rich depth, and thanks to new key systems, the instruments became much more precise. Then, to make that new, richer sound even fuller, they'd often just have 3 or 4 musicians on each type of instrument. Now for the brass section, trumpets, horns, and trombones. Their transformation was maybe the most dramatic of all. They went from being the guys who mostly played fanfares and signals to becoming true melodic superstars. The key was a single piece of tech, the valve system. This was a total game changer. Before valves, horns and trumpets could only play a handful of natural tones. But with valves, they could suddenly play every single note in the scale, just like a violin or a piano. This changed everything. And the result? Horns and trumpets could now carry the main melody. The trombone, along with the newly added tuba, provided this incredibly powerful low foundation. And when they all played together, they created that epic wall of sound we know from the most dramatic movie scenes. So what about percussion? Well, the drum section evolved from a simple timekeeper into a full-blown special effects machine that was all about creating atmosphere. Suddenly, there was a huge new toolbox. The big bass drum and cymbals for that massive crash, the triangle and glockenspiel for bright, sparkly accents, the harp for magical, dreamy moments. Some composers even called for actual church bells or an anvil to create very specific moods. The orchestra basically became its own sound effects studio. Now, with all these loud new instruments, the strings, violins, violas, cellos, and double basses had to keep up. Their solution wasn't new technology, but pure numbers. And this number says it all. You'd often have over 60 string players on stage. This massive group was absolutely necessary to balance out the powerful brass and woodwinds, and to lay down that rich, emotional carpet that everything else is built on. Without them, the core of the orchestra would be missing. Okay, so we've got the new hardware, but who were the people who pushed this upgraded orchestra to its absolute limits, and even beyond? Those were the master composers. Richard Wagner was one of the biggest visionaries. He wanted a very specific sound, and if the instrument for it didn't exist, he'd just have it built, like the Wagner tuba. He's also the guy who came up with the idea of putting the orchestra in a pit in front of the stage so the music wouldn't drown out the singers. And he famously used leitmotifs, short musical ideas for a specific character or object, to tell the story through music. And then you had Gustav Mahler. This quote sums up his philosophy perfectly. He wanted his music to reflect all of life, all its highs and lows, its beauty and its chaos. And he took that literally. His Eighth Symphony is nicknamed the Symphony of 1,000 because for its first performance, there were over 1,000 musicians and singers on stage. It's the absolute peak of orchestral ambition, and it's still an unbelievable spectacle to witness today. Of course, an orchestra this huge needs new rules to even function. You could say it needed a new operating system to manage all these moving parts. I mean, think about it. How do you get over 100 people to start at the exact same moment, play in the same tempo, and sound like a single unified entity?
That is a massive challenge. The answer is the conductor. This role didn't really exist in the same way before, but with such a huge ensemble, a central leader became essential. The conductor isn't just a timekeeper, they're the artistic director. They shape the sound, decide on dynamics and expression, and make sure that 100 individual voices become one powerful voice.
The second key element is orchestration. This is the art of mixing the different instrumental sounds. A composer is like a painter with a giant palette of colors. They can mix the flute with the violins for a silky sound, or the trombones with the low strings for a dark, menacing atmosphere. This art was perfected in the 19th century. And now we get to the part that explains why all this is still super relevant to you today. Because this gigantic 19th century orchestra, it never really went away. In fact, you know this epic, emotional, and bombastic sound very, very well. You probably just heard it yesterday. The sound of the late Romantic orchestra is the direct DNA of modern film scores. John Williams, the genius who wrote the music for Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Indiana Jones, is a master of this tradition. The same goes for the epic soundtracks of video games like The Legend of Zelda or The Last of Us. They all harness the power and the colors of this orchestral upgrade. So think about it. What was the last movie or game where the music was so unbelievably epic it gave you goosebumps? Chances are, you can thank the composers of the 19th century who invented that very sound. Thanks for watching.